Hello and welcome to Rough Cut Film Review. I've got a review of The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey by Peter Jackson. Of all the reviews I've done for Rough Cut, this is definitely the hardest by a long way. But let's start the review at the beginning. So I saw this film last night. I saw the full fat version, by which I mean running at 48 frames per second. It's the first film ever to have done that. The usual, I think, is 24. And I saw it in 3D because I knew that this is the experience that Peter Jackson wanted me to see, and I trust him enough to actually go and see that, even though it cost me more money. So The Hobbit was actually only one book. This is the first part of what is intended to be and what will be a trilogy of Hobbit films. And this one alone runs in at around about 3 hours. So he's got an awful lot of material out of this. So let's start with Peter Jackson. So why do I like Peter Jackson? I've got an awful lot of respect for him. I think he's an extremely clever man and a very interesting filmmaker. I remember as a kid, I used to love his early shock horror films. So, you know, they were sort of horror comedies like Bad Taste and particularly Brain Dead, which was and probably still is the bloodiest film ever made. There's that climactic scene at the end which involves the protagonist Lionel. He's eviscerating the undead with a lawnmower, and then his love interest, I think she was called Paquita, is then feeding the twitching severed extremities into a blender, for comic shock effect really. And as a kid I thought that was absolutely brilliant. The film also features a kung fu fighting priest who gets bitten and then impaled on a gravestone. And, you know, Jackson wasn't the most subtle filmmaker in his youth. His films were baggy, they were all over the place, and they were very nerdy. But they were very, very interesting. And, Sumerian rat monkeys don't really exist, which is just completely ridiculous. So later on in his career, he went on to make The Lord of the Rings. He made The Lord of the Rings out of everyone else in the world because he was the one that was obsessed with doing it enough, and he pushed and pushed and pushed. He made it very obvious to people that he was incredibly clever and he could do it. New Line Cinema, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like everything, has its critics, but for me, I think it's a note-perfect film trilogy of Tolkien's original works. You can, criticise Jackson for being too fussy, but, Tolkien was far too... I'm pronouncing that wrong. He was far too fussy as well, so I think this is very much Tolkien's vision up on the screen. That is the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. I think it's exactly how Tolkien would have wanted it to be. Warts and all, so, I think it's... So anyway, so Jackson took the natural step of making The Hobbit. He's got remarkable enthusiasm and he's very nerdy in the best possible way. He's a filmmaker who obsesses about what he's doing. He rewrites things constantly, dozens and dozens of times, often in the same day. He'll do different rewrites, which I'm sure must drive the actors absolutely bonkers. He worries about absolutely every single little detail of what he's doing and how he can possibly direct and produce the best possible version of Tolkien's work that he absolutely can. And I think that there are very few people working that have that kind of drive and that kind of passion, and I can't compliment that enough. We've got a problem with The Hobbit really, is that The Lord of the Rings was a very grown-up trilogy. It was incredibly epic, and it was, it wrapped everything up brilliantly. We've now got to go back to sort of prequel land, to before that, and The Hobbit is really more of a children's story. It's more of a, I suppose you call it now, a pre-teen story. It's the sort of story you do. I was read The Hobbit when I was probably 4 by my dad, so it's very difficult then to go back. And a lot of the criticism about Warhorse, for example, was that it was too simplistic, it was too sort of childlike, but that is the source material and that's who it's aimed at. You can't have everything as Saving Private Ryan, but when this is following on from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, I think there's a problem. You could also, it's fantastic that Peter Jackson loves the source material so much, and clearly he does. And I've seen interviews when he was making Lord of the Rings where he was saying, as a kid he was obsessed with it. Now, possibly he loves Lord of the Rings too much and The Hobbit too much, because he is making an absolutely faithful recreation, for better or worse, and that is potentially a problem. Because this is a story for kids, we get things like, you know, a set piece where there is a brown wizard, and I can't remember his name, in a bunny-pulled sled trying to escape from orcs riding wolves that we have led up to this point to believe that they're very scary. One of the dwarves, one of the main characters, the sort of the fellowship of this film, is has got a slingshot which he shoots people with comic effect to. So it's very difficult for this to stand alone on its own legs, with all the background and all the pressure from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And then, unfortunately, we've got these comedic little moments which are designed for children. So this is very much Lord of the Rings light. It's, you know, smaller people. There are fewer panoramic shots, which I loved in the original. There's a less powerful Gandalf, and there's lots of background stuff in there for the Lord of the Rings and for this. So I think it's very difficult for this to survive as a story in its own right. It definitely can't compete with the Lord of the Rings, but it would have stood a better chance, I think, if we hadn't had the constant reminders and the references. The hero in this one is a dwarf lord who looks a lot like Aragorn did, except obviously he's shorter in stature, and he looks a lot like Gowron as well from, if you know, Star Trek. There's a really hilarious looking character called Gowron who has this very intense stare. You know, it's difficult. It's like they've scaled everything down. Everything is slightly less impressive. Everything is slightly less epic. There are too many sort of minecart style escapes by the dwarves, you know, from goblins or whoever it is. These set pieces all look amazing, but they don't really amount to very much. They look great, but is that enough? I don't know. I mean, maybe for kids it is, but for, you know, an adult discerning, viewer, I don't think it is. The weight of expectation, as I've alluded to, doesn't do its own, you know, doesn't do this really much good. It's very difficult. I mean, there's a few wonderful fight sequences in this, and there's one involving stone giants, and you know, you sit there thinking this looks absolutely amazing, but it's just a spectacle. It's just a sort of minecart ride. So the actors are absolutely excellent. We've got the returning cast. And you know, who are really good, so Ian McKellen and, you know, etc. That also people like Martin Freeman does a really, really good job as a young Bilbo. He's absolutely fantastic. But again, we've got this really uncomfortable the Dwarf Lord, the Aragorn hybrid type guy. He's very intense, he's very serious, and he suffered tragedy. But then that's got to rub alongside one of the other Fellowship companions, who is, you know, a big fat ginger dwarf who gobbles a whole wheel of cheese. And, you know, emotionally, I was slightly confused. Are we supposed to be going along with the tragedy and the dark stuff with the orcs and the goblins and Gollum and a dragon, or are we supposed to be just sort of chuckling that, you know, the CGI looking dwarf has just gobbled a wheel of cheese? And I'm not sure, and it sits very uncomfortably. The two things rub alongside each other and they do not mesh whatsoever. So we have the serious plot and the prosthetic noses and the slapstick silliness, and the two things will not and do not go together, and it makes you feel very uncomfortable as to what they're trying to achieve and where you're actually going with any of this. Anyway, right, so I'll stop there because I'll go into a second part and I need to talk about the 3D, and I need to give you a sense that actually this is a good film. So kind regards, see you in part 2.